Jake, how's it going, man?
What's going on, Mark? Man, we had a nice week off, mostly because I didn't have that much to talk about, and I didn't have that much to talk about this week, and I was like, "Oh, we can talk about this." And why do we don't have that much to talk about? Because we want to uh, dive in to the art of coasting with your reef tank, right? It's really fun, especially when you just start out the hobby. First year or two, all you can think of is eat, sleep, reef. And then as you know, life comes along, you find ways to just like kind of enjoy your tank from a distance. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit later in this session of reef therapy.
Sounds like a good plan. I
Yeah.
would say I have not been coasting well with my aquarium these last couple of weeks, but I've had my phases where I do, and so I feel like it's a good subject we can get into, and
And
maybe
you
I should.
famously coined the phrase benign neglect, which I don't know why that's really stuck with me because it's not neglect, but it is benign because you can't just always be doing something. Sometimes that
Yeah.
tank just needs you to leave it the freak alone. And but before we get into that, what have you been up to?
Oh man, man, I got a lot of little bullet points about my aquarium. Let's see. I broke up my little NSA aquascape. I don't know if we talked about that last week. But
Uh, just give us a recap of what NSA stands for, what you did, the gluing
sure.
process, and then how you came full circle to no more.
Yeah, and a lot of this boils back to stick to your original intent. But anyway, so I thought a lot of the stuff I saw online and people doing these really neat, let's call them rock sculptures, right? Where
That's
I
a
mean,
fair description, yeah.
yeah. So NSA negative space aquascape, right? Um, I don't know what you would consider a good definition of that, but it's essentially the
That's
idea
easy.
of
That's
yeah.
easy. That's when there's more open water than, you know, actual stuff in the tank.
Okay, there you go. But one of the common things you'll see is like a rock sculpture in sort of like the shape of a tree with branches coming out of it,
Dude,
right?
that
So
I've seen that so much.
yeah,
It's like there's no other ideas out in the world.
yeah, and it's cool like, from you got all these little overhangs and all that stuff. So I needed to break up a bunch of my rock work to get it to fit in my tank, and I got creative with some super glue and sand, and I think we talked about it in a previous episode, but
Mm-hmm.
Tidal Gardens did a great video on how to sculpt with this high viscosity glue, where you can glue two rocks together almost instantly with some oolite sand. But
Low
um,
viscosity. Very runny.
sorry, wouldn't that be high viscosity?
High viscosity would be super thick.
Oh, okay.
We don't have to
Um,
stick. I mean, I might be wrong,
yeah,
but we don't
yeah.
have to.
So, but it had it's like almost like rubbing alcohol. It even looks thinner than like water in a cup. But um, so I built one of these trees thinking that would be kind of fun, but I just didn't like it. It actually, I mean, no surprise, a negative space aquascape would have less room to mount and grow corals and give them room to grow. Um, the overhangs create areas where, yeah, you could put some shade tolerant corals, but it just didn't jive with me. I don't know. I ended up rejecting it. So I took that rock out. I broke it up into its original pieces, and I actually put the most boring pile of rocks in the middle. But
Well, let me ask you there, Mark. Did you use some dry rock? Was this live rock? Was it seeded or was it cured rock? I've had some challenges with some dry rock lately, and I really feel like I'm gonna need to go back to my live rock roots.
I would say it was a little bit of everything. Old rock from my old tank, some new rocks I picked up from the fish store when I set up the new tank. It's just a mix. Anyway, much happier with that. One of the more arguable, if it's true or not, but it's in my brain, and so I believe it is. A lot more natural behavior suddenly coming out of my pygmy angel, my flame angel, darting in and out of those rocks. And that's the other thing about these NSAs is they're sculptures, but unless you're, depending on how you glue it all together, there's not a lot of hidey holes for fish when you do
This is
that.
so true. This is one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to working with the Tropic Eden Morocco rock, because our man-made Carib Sea rock and Marco Marco's like perforated, right? And so is the Carib
Hmm.
Sea and Real Reef, but it's not like crevices and little caves and stuff for microfish to really get into. And when you get really all in on NSA, you just end up with this trunk. This trunk with branches coming off, and there's like no crevices for fish to go into. And I thought that was a really cool observation from you about the behavior of your fish changing just like that.
Yeah, I mean, this guy would swim more like a tang, just kind of pace the tank, and now he's using the holes to get around the reef, right? So he kind of
Hmm.
darts in and out, and he's kind of formed like, okay, I can go from this cave to that cave to that cave. Um, so that was kind of cool. I reduced the output on my lights. And again, this goes back to I had the intent of just going with a low maintenance LPS softy tank, which is what the predecessor tank was. And I was quite happy with that outcome. But then, you set up a new tank and your brain goes crazy and tries negative space aquascapes and, this and that. And then I just put on a new set of lights I'd never used before and started tinkering with that. And but we a while back we were discussing some of the classic corals, like you're just your discosomas and stuff like that. And I have these just old school blue discosomas that they were okay, but they're not in their prime like
Hmm.
primo form. And so then I started pulling out the par meter and kind of thinking, okay, well, yes, I've got some acros high up. It is a mixed reef, but what if I bring the par down to maybe something that things like mushrooms and some of the lower light corals? I mean, and don't get me wrong, like I think leathers and sinularia and all that love high intensity lighting, in my opinion. But what if I, instead of favoring the upper end of par, like I go down and I'm still in a range where the SBS I think are content, and just see how those some of those things like discosomas and stuff start to react. Now the hard part about the Kessels is they have such good penetration that the difference in par from my sand bed and the top, and probably because I'm using those narrow reflectors, is only like 20 to 50 micromoles. So I can't
That's a
really
very
affect.
that's a very
Yeah.
small difference from top to bottom.
Yeah, and the 50 is on the outer edges by the glass where there's reflection, whereas you get more in the center bottom, it's definitely, 20 micromole difference between the top. But once you get in the center, you only get about 50. So even if I have 200 at the top, I'm getting like 180 down where I wanted to put some of the lower light stuff. So I'm kind of going through my brain like, do I lower the lights and go with a wider reflector and see if that gives me more of a disparity? I don't know, but so I brought the output down just a little bit, and then the other thing that I'm really struggling with is I cannot register nitrates, man. I'm dosing, I'm feeding,
Add
and
some
I
sand to
just
your tank.
I have crushed coral. Like that's supposed to be a nitrate factory, right? I've got
The first
crushed
thing that came
coral.
to mind, I'm just like, just add more sand. It'll catch up.
It's which is another reason I think some of those things like the discosomas are not in their primo form because they could probably benefit from a little
Yes.
bit of that. So
I
just
think
again
it's
tinkering.
probably misguided to say that, oh, this is too much light for my discosomas, when in the past we've had troubles with different discosoma varieties, doesn't matter which type, kind of encroaching on your SPS in a metal halide aquarium. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's really easy to point the finger at too much light, but I'm still all learning all this, relearning all this stuff. Definitely little doses of nitrates and certain traces will just get them to puff up, but definitely some organic matter in the water, that'll make them super happy.
Yeah, and I mean I've had these blue mushrooms lingering on rocks that throughout my different tanks since the metal halide days. It's not like I went out and bought new ones. And you're right. I mean, they did all right under the halides. So, but I just keep hearing people giving these crazy par recommendations for different tank types. So I thought, all right, I'll try. Maybe the higher par back in the day worked better because there's also higher nutrients, and now I've got zeroed out nitrates with high par, and maybe I got to meet somewhere in the middle where I increase my nutrients, but I bring the energy that I'm blasting those corals with down too, so that I bring the rate of flow. Sort of like you've got the highlight planted tanks where you've got to dose a bunch of crap, you got to add a bunch of CO2, and then you've got like the more Wallstad method tanks where you bring the lighting down and just let the rate of photosynthesis be slower, right? So you don't have to dose
If there's
and do all that
any
stuff.
gearheads out there, it's so comparable to driving a car, right? You want to drive a car faster, you got to turbo inject the fuel, you have to add a lot of oxygen, you got to get rid of a lot of exhaust and heat. It's you can't just move one slider, right? A lot of sliders have to move in unison, and it's the same with corals.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I know we've talked about challenges with shrooms, but I set up I earmarked one section of what was formerly my fish quarantine system. Got anemones throughout, some medium light corals in the middle, and on the bottom there's two different sections of this 48-inch tank. And on the left is the shroom room, and on the right is the Chalice Palace, which is funny because those are totally taken from like Facebook groups. But one is filled with chalices, the other one's filled with Discosomas, Rhodactis, and Recordia. Oh my goodness, the par in there, man! Just eyeballing it cannot be over 30.
Oh, really?
It cannot be over maybe 50 micromoles at most, but it's so dark in there, and the shrooms, and they're all just so big. I need to like add a little I have a lot of purple rhodactis. I got purple rhodactis with like a slight green rim, another rock of purple rhodactis with like some spots and stuff, but they just look black. They look black under that blue light, so I need to introduce just a touch of white lighting to make some of those more rosy tones kind of come out. But the chalice on the other side, man, having been diving and seen chalices in all kinds of environments, you will never find a chalice just exposed unless the water's incredibly turbid, which by definition is not exposed. But yeah, I've got some, not too many oxyporas. I'm not a huge fan of oxyporas overall, but mycediums and echinophilias, God, they're living their best life. I picked up a coral that I had agreed to buy, I guess, when on my tour for Black Friday. You've seen kind of some orangish and green streaked chalices before. Think like rainbow style chalice, bright orange red, more red than orange, with bright green and like tons of flesh on it. Oh my God, I cannot believe that was a trade-in and how cheap I got it. Just a shade over 3 digits. Like, I couldn't believe it. I keep looking at this coral, I'm like, I remember a certain dealer, I'm not sure if he's still in business, like paying $2,000 wholesale for the coral like it, anyway, the Chalice coral tank is doing really awesome. Makes me very happy.
I saw a really cool rainbow chalice. I just got my latest coral magazine issue in the mail today, and it has some ACI aquaculture pictures, and they had a cool rainbow chalice in there. I did go on a little spending spree, end of year, so got like the results for work performance and all that good stuff.
Oh,
and
cool.
I was like, okay, I deserve a little treat. And again, and I thought, all right, I'm not really big on hyped up corals, but I can't deny that some of the mushrooms that have become available over I guess the last couple of years have been pretty cool. So I thought, all right, I don't really see them often around here. I have seen some bounce mushrooms and stuff at my local fish store, but so I ordered a bounce mushroom. Just looks like a rhodactis with little balloons on it, right?
The OG bounce?
Orange and green. I don't know.
Well, if it didn't have another name,
names.
then it's the bounce mushroom.
Okay, yeah. It's
it's orange to green vesicles.
Yes.
Yeah,
and that's in person. It's a pretty cool coral.
It is not a coral, but it's very cool.
Sorry, yeah. Then I bought a original Jawbreaker, like the one Mark Paletti had.
Yes.
I haven't gotten that one yet. And then I ordered a one of the newer eclectus mushrooms, Jawbreakers, with more
God,
green and stuff
you're
going on.
really on a shroom kick. I'm kind of
Yeah.
surprised. I just thought you wanted to. That's why I'm really happy I have them in a separate tank, and that way they can just go bananas in that tank. And I already see like a 3 foot long display just for them in the future. But I'm kind of
It's
surprised
ridiculous
that.
to how much those three mushrooms cost me though. It's like when they come in and you're like, wow, that's a lot of money in a very small space. But I don't
Hmm.
know, when you're kind of going for that softy thing.
Those three though, the OG Jawbreaker, the Eclectus, and the original Bounce Mushroom, those were worth it. God, they are just so freaking beautiful. Yeah,
They're
those
really
those
neat, yeah.
those are worth it. I can't see myself like paying for Jawbreakers because I have a strain of like really orange other discosoma. They're like right in between. They're not like the super thin tissue of typical discosomas, but they're not like
Hmm.
the really fleshy, meaty Jawbreaker that you could actually eat. So I already have this rock, and I got the rock. It was a trade-in.
Oh,
It
that was
again,
yeah. I remember
it
you
was like, I don't
sharing
know, it
that
was
with
like
me.
$80 or something, and
Yeah.
I got two pieces, and it started shedding, polyps all over the place, and I have them everywhere. I'm like, all right, I know what the Jawbreaker is, and this is not it. But if you just look at it from a distance, yeah, I got a rock of Jawbreakers, or at least discosomas that are as orange as that. So, if one falls in my lap, I'll be all about it. But yeah, but you got some good strains, as far as if you were starting a real shroom collection, you got some really awesome ones.
Yeah, it was. I mean, like I said, I don't normally spend that kind of dough on corals, but it was just, you
It's
know,
exciting. It's exciting to find
I
things that
kind of
you
went on a
are
rampage,
into.
Yeah, and again, with the intent of, I talked about reducing my lights a little bit and just, once the tank was put together, I got a little bit sidetracked where I did pick up a couple of SBS and then you know, got more intense lighting and then you start to kind of go down a different
Best
rabbit hole and then
laid
you're like,
plans.
yeah. So I backpedaled a bit, like, hey, let's go back to the original plan. Yeah, I mean, the other thing is I have a Regal Angel. I have, Flame Angels are pretty reef safe, coral safe, but I do like, keeping somewhat risky fish. And so a lot of the lobed LPS, even though I will gamble with some of those,
Hmm.
they may not be in my future.
Right. So
It is
speaking
what
of
it is.
pygmy angelfish, I haven't told you this, but yesterday I got a handful of Brazilian flameback angelfish from
Ooh.
SDCERI. I think I was actually talking to Elliot Lim, and he kind of knows what's on my wish list, and he gave me a heads up. And it's so funny, just almost how virtually identical they are to the African flamebacks, but they're not.
Yeah.
Instead of being orange top with really navy blue bodies of the African flameback, they're a little bit more yellow topped, and one of them is like a real yellow flame back, with just ever so slightly lighter shade of blue on the side, and then the solid blue tail. And they're a little bit more squared off in their body than the rounded African flamebacks. And to the casual observer, they're basically the same fish. But to me, I'm like, oh no, that's the Brazilian flameback. I've been looking for those for a long time. So big ups to SDCERI for sending those along. And they're 1 day through quarantine, so not getting too attached to them till they've been through a good 2 to 3 or 4 week quarantine, at least a 2 week isolation, and another couple weeks of conditioning. But I'm thinking I got a couple tanks. I got one tank that's my kitchen. I call it my kitchen sink reef because everything that looks good but is a little bit too big to be in the coral flats goes in there. And then there's the mangrove tank with just all leather corals. So I'm thinking, I'm hoping I can get them to become a harem in the 10-gallon tank with a ton of hiding places. And then I'm on the fence of whether I'm going to put them with just the leather corals in the mangrove tank or in the kitchen sink tank that has all the different types of corals. If I put them in the kitchen sink tank with all the different types of corals, for sure they're going to find something they want to nip on. So we'll see how that goes. I think I'm leaning towards the mangrove tank because that one has a little bit more daylight spectrum, which I feel is going to bring out the blue and the yellow a lot better.
Oh, for sure. That would be
Yeah.
a fish that I would definitely not put under the heavy blue light.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah, I don't know. I think you'd appreciate just this slightly esoteric version of a pygmy angelfish. Like I said, the African flame blacks have weirdly become um, almost as popular or as widespread and widely available as coral beauties,
yeah.
and flame angelfish.
It used to
But
be the
like,
other
yeah.
way around, right? Where the Brazilians were
Hmm.
more common and the Africans were more rare.
Yes, yes. It's so strange that how the supply chains work these days.
Yeah. That's
Did you
still
finish talking about what you wanted to say about your aquascape?
mostly, yeah. The only other thing I was
Okay.
going to add, and you brought up a great point because you were talking about Elliot, is the other thing that's been rummaging through my brain is I've got a 20-gallon coral kind of quarantine, and
Mm-hmm.
then I've got a fish quarantine. But then I sat there, and I'm not one that's going to always buy coral, right? There's a finite
Mm-hmm.
amount of space. I just want to get things stocked up, and then, like the subject we're going to talk about, want to let the tank coast. So I'm sitting there kind of thinking, like, well, at some point, I will not need to keep those quarantine tanks running. And so I'm trying to rummage my brain around this 60-inch shelf that can support a lot of weight that I built in my basement where I've got all my, other stuff wired up. And I thought, with now the availability of quarantine fish from, I think I can think of 3 vendors off the top of my head, and I know there's more. And having had such a good experience with TSM, do I back off on the fish quarantine and just commit to only buying quarantine fish? And then on the coral thing, I don't really need a really big system, or I don't even need a 20-gallon. I just need like a little 10-gallon where I can
Mm-hmm.
isolate some things for a few weeks. Um, and that would free up that whole area to put something bigger that I can, grow out. Because the one thing I have been having fun is when I have bought a coral, I kind of keep it around in the basement for a while till I can get it fragged or split, and then I put a fragment in the big tank and I kind of leave a piece behind. So my coral tank, my coral quarantine tank, is turning into a reef tank of sorts. But I also kind of like it as
That
a
always
like an
happens.
arc, right? Where
It always
if
happens.
yeah. Yeah, and it's one, it's fun, and two, if I lose the coral in the main tank, I have a backup, which I kind of like. So,
Absolutely.
you just recently wrote about the new Acrion 60 breeder,
I got one.
and did you get one already? They're in stock in one of the stores here, and I almost went to pick one up before our talk. But how do you like it?
Oh, I mean, I'm not using it for anything, and it was during their $1 a gallon sale, and I'm just like, oh my god, are they going to be selling these for $60 in the future? Because it was
That would be cool if they
$200,
did. Yeah.
full price with tax and all that. Um, but I really felt it was important to demonstrate to the Reef Builders audience that you can make a sump out of anything, right? So I
Mhm.
literally have another sump almost virtually the same size. Um, but I'm going to start with this sump and start piecing it together. And the way the tank is put together, or the stand is put together, it's actually not going to be too hard to take off a side panel and like slide it out and put a real sump in there in the future if I am so inclined. But yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you think. It's a 4 foot 40 breeder, which makes it 60 gallons. But God, I take the inner dimensions of the sump and this other tank. It's 55 gallons. I'm really annoyed that we're still calling tanks by their complete volume, not what they hold in
Mhm.
water. I'm not even subtracting that top inch of the tank actually running, but a 180-gallon tank. Once you do factor in that 1 inch, it holds like 160 gallons. Or
Yeah.
155 gallons. I'm like, how is this okay? How are we like a 10-gallon tank? Take the internal dimensions. It's probably 8.5 to 9. But we're just proceeding, and a lot of very diligent reef keepers don't really account for the rock displacements, or even if they account for the rock displacement and the addition of their sump, they don't really know the internal volume of the aquarium. Right, it's called a 180. Your 180 holds about 20 gallons, 30 gallons less than you think. Anyway, that's a different tangent. But yeah, I like it, and I just thought it was a really cool opportunity. It's so funny because, like, some people are into sneakers, or some others folks are into wreckers or fashion, and I just want to be able to say 20 years from now, I was like, I got one of the first ever 60 breeders. I'm actually so you told me about this. I remember when I was loading it up, I was like, I would not be getting this tank or even know about this tank if you hadn't told me about it. But yeah, if the 60 breeder continues to be made and it becomes as iconic and versatile as a 40 breeder has been for decades and decades, I want to be able to say, like, I got one of the first ones like I could ever find. So that was pretty cool. It's just sitting in front of the tank, but I am committed to getting the 400-gallon at least flowing in some capacity and before reef stock.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people are waiting to see what that tank will become. Yeah, for me, I hate 40 breeders. I used to love them, but
What?
I had two that started to bow beyond my comfort level, and you would call Aqueon up and they're like, yeah, that's normal, that's fine. But then I had bubbles in the seams, and I just didn't like that. I'm a bit paranoid about that kind of stuff. So what I liked about the 60 breeder, like Sipora, I think that's the brand, makes a 40 breeder with a center brace, and most reefers hate center braces because of the lighting, shadowing, and I completely get that. But for a budget tank where you're not going to have extra thick glass or perimeter bracing or anything like that, where it's just going to be a cheap tank for whatever, I like that the 60 had a brace, and I like the larger footprint.
It's got a brace, all right. It's got a big old fat brace all around the edge and right down the middle. But no, I think it'll be really informative to show people, like, I am really crossing my fingers, not just for myself but for everybody else, that tank falls under the $1-gallon sale in the future.
Oh yeah, man.
But I really wanted to demonstrate that, like, yeah, you can spend hundreds or 1,000 or more on a sump, or you can just get a glass box, and it could probably, like, I love a beautiful sump and a beautiful equipment layout as much as the next person, but you spend 98%, 99% of your time looking at the tank, not looking at the sump. So this will be a cool
perfect sump
opportunity.
tank, and it's a perfect frag tank for especially if they do the $1 a gallon, which I'm not so sure they will, but even
the 75 was the 75-gallon tank.
Why not do the
which
60
is
then?
more material and more. It was probably just so new, right?
Mhm.
They didn't have their printed material. Didn't even factor for the 60 breeder. So maybe in the future it will, or maybe it's just, I'm actually quite shocked that Aqueon released this size. The Zoom Ed Low Boy has been kind of filling that niche, and Aqueon, besides like some odd shaped kind of starter tank sizes like 5, 10, 15, 20, up to about 45. They haven't experimented with the recipe since they bought All Glass Aquarium, right? They've been making the exact same tank. So to have a 60 breeder as a standard size, that really surprised me.
Yeah, it was a cool little surprise. And we talked about simple reef tanks back a few podcasts ago, and I just thought it'd be a fun experiment because it's a decent sized tank. I could put a Tunzi skimmer in the corner and a Tunzi comm line in the other corner. So now you've got surface skimming, you've got a place to put media, you have protein skimming, and then throw a heater in and throw some lights on top, and you got essentially an all-in-one reef tank, right? Or just put an overflow filter on the back. Obviously you can get even more simple, but it just, I like the, I get, I romanticize certain ideas in my brain when I'm sitting around, and that one got in my head because that's essentially how I run my 20-gallon, so just scale it up and have a little more fun with it. Anyway, that's probably more than we needed to talk to about a tank from Petco.
Oh,
yeah.
No. So just for anyone that's listening, I reached out to Central Pet, Aqueon, and a bunch of stores. Then my understanding is that this is going to be a Petco exclusive for a few weeks. I don't know why. Like, why bother? But yeah, I don't know. Maybe Petco is the one that asked for it. Maybe it's got like some reptile applications, for
they do have a picture of it as a terrarium on their site.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be
As an
surprised if it came around in like a circuitous way. But yeah, I have no doubt that in the next few years of reef shows, we're going to be seeing 60 breeders popping up. Maybe not as much as the low boys because the low boys are, huge surface area and lighter. This thing is heavy duty for sure. But
That's
all
good.
right, that's enough about the 60 breeder. Well, I think it's a good time to make a little announcement about our first ever live session of Reef Therapy. You want to tell them about it, Mark?
Yeah, apparently you convinced me to do this in person at the Aquatic Expo in Atlanta. Uh, so we'll see how that goes. No, I'm looking forward to that. That'll be fun. Um,
I promise you, when you and I are on stage, I won't even notice anyone else. I only have eyes for you, my brother.
oh,
No, it'll be like you and I are just having a session of Reef Therapy, but together,
I
in the
thought
same
I thought
room.
we were
In the
gonna
same
do it
room.
in like a booth, just kind of have fun, like we're reporting from the sidelines. And then when you mentioned that it was gonna be like a talk, I was like, oh, okay. So,
Yeah, and I think we
but
can, without rehashing too much of the topics we've already discussed, put together a topic that really just features and spotlights the current state of the aquarium hobby, from
yeah,
prices to coral names to gear to trends. Um, Maybe leaning less on what has come before, and then kind of really looking forward. So it'll be kind of an open-ended topic, and you and I will have our notes. But I mean, honestly, we have no idea where it's gonna go until it happens. But that will be recorded and then syndicated after that. So if you're in the Atlanta area, like Mark is, definitely make sure to give a look at the Aquatic Expo first weekend of April in Atlanta. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun.
and I'm looking forward to it because I'm always still a freshwater geek at heart. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I haven't really been to like a freshwater oriented. I mean, I've never been to Aquashell or anything like that. So I'm just excited to get a good dose of, obviously the reef keeping hobby in person again, but also just to put some faces and some experiences on the freshwater side, personally speaking.
It's we're such hobbyists in the reef world that we've like turned over just about every stone there is to turn over, except for like new ideas and new concepts. And so anytime I take a look at freshwater stuff, I'm an avid freshwater aquarist. I got 4 or 5 freshwater tanks going on right now. It's just, I don't know, it's just more novel. It's more
Hmm.
novel. I'm not talking about the aquascaping stuff, but I love geophagus, dwarf cichlids. I love my zebra plecos, wild angelfish, different discus strains. Oh my God! If anybody out there knows where to get some good discus, at me any way that you can, because it's weird. It's so strange because right now the discus market is really divided between some very expensive, high quality wild fish and fairly cheap, mass produced domesticated strain. I'm just like, man, where's the middle ground? Can I get some F1 or F2s of some wild strains? And, the fancy domesticated strains are also pretty easy to come across. But I mean, if I had to pick, I'd do some of the one and some of the other. But like I do know that wild discus are like a huge pain because they come in with all the diseases, and they've had a rough and tumble life in the wild, in a way that I don't think saltwater fish experience the same way. If saltwater fish has a bad day, it gets eaten. If a freshwater
Yeah.
fish has a bad day, like it loses some fins or gets scraped up or it bonks into something. So anyway, yeah, discus. But it'll be super fun to have both sides. I mean, I've definitely been informing my reef aquarium experience with cross pollination from horticulture, ponds, freshwater aquascaping, and freshwater aquarium keeping. And so, yeah, that'll be a fun time to always see what's happening on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think it was a week or two ago. I sent you a picture of some crazy Corydoras I'd never seen before, and you were like, "Oh yeah, that's this new species." Blah blah blah. It just shows that even as much as I'm a freshwater geek, there's still, it's whenever for the listeners, whenever you quit keeping freshwater fish, or maybe you never did, that hobby didn't stand still. I mean, it's
No.
still, if you jump back, it'd be just a shock to some of the
The really
different
cool thing
species
about
and
freshwater fish is when they
cultivars.
discover new species, I don't think there's almost any freshwater fish that they haven't been able to breed. I know the Panac, the very large wood-eating plecos, have been a real challenge for a number of years, but like 99% of the freshwater fish in the freshwater aquarium hobby are captive raised, or they can be raised. Tetras, cories, cichlids, it's just a matter of finding that little trick. Whereas like saltwater fish, I'm like, yes, some one person is going to have to dedicate a handful or more years just to get halfway there. With a freshwater fish like those funky corridors, I think it was CW111, zebra cory. You know, they're not zebraed as zebra plecos, but they are really cool with a very tall,
They're crazy,
very
yeah.
flamboyant dorsal. Remember when those first were available? Oh yeah, they were selling for about $1,000 a piece in Asia, and now the prices come down to like $300 to $400 per individual captive bred. And I'm just like, all right, I can keep an eye on that number and watch
Yeah.
it fall to
Maybe another
closer
year or
to
two.
200 probably another three or five.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if you're in the Atlanta area or want to come to a different kind of crossover show, Aquatic Expo in Atlanta is going to be fun, and Mark and I will be there geeking out on both the fresh and the salt.
Yes, sir.
So today's topic is really interesting because around the new year and around the 6-month mark, so right between June and July, my brain just kind of clicks and just like, okay, what maintenance have I not done recently? Cleaning all the skimmers, cleaning all the pumps, siphoning detritus from, nether regions. And so for the last 2 weeks of December and the first couple weeks of January, I was just in full maintenance mode, just doing this, doing that, cleaning this, and it wasn't even like the physical work, it's just the mental work of like keeping track of like, all right, is everything done? We have a spreadsheet now, so we know when everything gets completed. But following that, I was just like, man, I don't want to do anything. I'll feed the fish and I'll look at the tanks, so I haven't been doing much. And so we're coming up with a topic for today's session, and I was just like, man, I'm not really doing anything. I'm just looking at the tanks. And I was like, oh, wait, if there's anyone who can squeeze an hour out of doing nothing with your reef tank, it's definitely, Jake and Mark of Reef Therapy. we could talk about doing nothing to your reef tank for a long time. Mark kind of coined the phrase benign neglect in a guest post on Reef Builders. God, that's like 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it's always kind of stuck in my mind because neglect implies that you are neglecting something and walking away, but benign means like you got some guardrails. You have some guardrails to make sure that you're not getting out of bounds and like forgetting to do something critical. So in this whole episode, we can definitely have a conversation about how important it is to leave your tank alone sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and there's two approaches, right? One is, what are some of the benefits of coasting for a while with your tank, and what can you derive out of that? And then the other side of it is, obviously, some design and thought has to be put into, I guess, neglecting a tank with good intentions, right?
Which I find hilarious because the folks with the most automated tanks, they can't do that. I think they can do that, but there's always something to look after in your automation system to keep it running in peak operating condition. So you can't just automate something and walk away. There's always a catch. But as a hobby, the definition of hobby is having something to do, and so we're compelled to always be doing something with our tanks. Don't get me wrong, about 9 months throughout the 12 of the year, I'm always doing something with my tanks, right? That is literally my job. But one of my best tanks in the studio is a Nano Reef tank that I just featured, which did really well with the YouTube algorithm. I got a lot of traffic, and I'm just like pointing at corals. I'm just like, yeah, we don't. Just talking for about 10 minutes about how little we do to this tank. It's crazy how much that resonates with people. But those are some of my best corals in that tank. Of the corals that I have throughout the tanks, the ones that are in the nano tank that doesn't get dosed, doesn't get tested, has had 4 or 5 water changes in 2 years, those, like the orange frog spawn, green star polyp, the gold torch coral, and a couple others, those are the best. Those are the best here. Out of all the tanks, because in other tanks they definitely experience some yo-yo effect with tweaking lights and flow and chemistry and nutrients, and you're always trying to push the envelope of what's possible, and sometimes you just need to stop it.
Yeah, wasn't I mean, speaking of high tech gear that you have to maintain, I believe that the guy who invented the automated alk testing, one of the first observations that they actually had was that when you stick your hand in the tank, they actually see alkalinity consumption drop, right? So there's obviously a direct benefit to keeping your hands out of the tank, but I think the other side of it is that, you're always striving for stability, but the biggest destabilizer is often you, right?
Oh, it's only you,
Yeah.
because you're in control of all the equipment and the programming and the scheduling. Obviously, there's extraneous things that can happen, but I fully agree with you. I'm not saying that we need to be like, vegans and just be like completely hands off and use that as a philosophy of reef keeping, but it's really important to sit back and understand how does your tank even behave when you're not doing stuff to it. If you're changing the lights 1 month, changing the float in the other, using a new salt a few weeks later, or if you're constantly just disrupting what's happening. I don't fetishize stability, capital S, the same as a lot of other folks, but if you're always doing stuff, how do you know what your tank is doing normally?
Yeah.
You really,
And how do you know which one of those things was the beneficial change or the negative change or, hold on, I got to sneeze. I'm fighting a cold.
So,
Excuse me.
doing nothing or having a long break of mostly observation can be really beneficial for the tank and as important, informative to you. How do you know what your baseline of polyp extension is? How do you know the actual sounds of your aquarium? I go by sounds of my aquariums like so much. Like certain sounds I expect to hear. Certain pumps get louder over time because they're getting a little clogged and they give me a little hum, and I can just be sitting watching TV or just scrolling the net and I hear the specific hum, like, oh yeah, the Red Sea Reef Wave, it's been 6 weeks, they're ready for a clean. And other pumps, I expect them to be loud. Like if you're a really diligent listener of reef therapy, you will occasionally hear this very quick sucking sound, because when my Nero 5s on my shallow reef tanks are super clean, they will periodically vortex. And you will heave that. So when they stop doing that, I'm just like, oh yeah, it's time to clean the Nero 5s. But you need to really learn what the behavior of your aquarium in all aspects, and the best way to do that is just kind of step back and just really take it all in.
Yeah, I think it's a good word for that would be like establishing a baseline for your tank, right? That you can compare against. I know I brought up in the past visual reef keeping, meaning I'm not a avid tester. I don't test for everything frequently. I watch people's YouTubes and they're talking about how they're doing weekly or daily alk testing and pH testing and or what are your nitrates and phosphates at? I have I've been testing nitrates lately just because I'm trying to kind of solve the riddle of why a super easy coral is sort of just hanging in there for me now. But generally when things are coasting, as you put it, I don't really test much, but I rely heavily on visual cues in my tank, right? We all have those indicator corals that give you an assessment of something being wrong. And the only way you pick up on those observations is if you have a baseline, but also when you do see something is different, and then you start to do the detective work and you whip out all the test kits and you do everything, and then you find what the culprit is. Now you go, okay, so next time I see my Montipora digitata look like that, I may not be right in assuming, but I'm going to assume that it's, this same thing. And so
Low
now
magnesium.
Yeah.
Low magnesium. If you've kept Montes in a mixed reef, or a lot of Montes in the same tank, that I don't know what it is about Montipora, but they do not like that low magnesium. I have used those as a test kits. I've had people call me up or reach out to me about monopora problems, and before I even finish reading their sentence, I'm like, test your magnesium, get back to me. Sure enough, you get below 1200, sometimes 1250 because of your test kit, errors. Yeah, that's one of them. That's just one of like many different things that you can learn about your tank, just from observation. But yeah, it's like if you're doing your own research, you need a control group, right? And if you only have one tank, your control group is your tank during that period of time where you left it alone. And we're not even talking about for a very long time.
No,
I'm
yeah.
thinking like a 2-week period, right? Month max. You're going to understand a lot of different things like, what is the weekly or monthly consumption rate of additives? That's really informative to know. Like, I know a lot of modern aquarium dosers will tell you, you can do the math of how often it's, emptying a reservoir if you mix it yourself or you buy certain additives. But that is really informative to know. Like you said, if for some reason that shoots up or shoots down, that's a great indicator. But if you don't know that baseline, you're not going to really notice whether your buffer consumption goes from 100 to 200 mLs a week or vice versa. You really got to, people talk about keeping a journal of everything that happens in your tank. I say just be aware of like the fundamentals. What does your tank usually run at temperature wise throughout the year? And then what does your pH usually run at again throughout the year? So yeah, I think there's just a lot to learn about your own reef tank. You're not stagnant. You're not sitting there doing nothing, but you're just not messing with stuff. You just have to use your eyes, your imagination, your observation, and some critical thinking skills to tie some things together.
Yeah, for me too, I like if you do have things that you want to change, and this is sort of what I'm going through. Like I said in the beginning, I fully admit I'm not in a coasting stage at the moment. I'm starting to tinker, but to be honest, that arose out of a coastal phase, right? Where I one was real busy with work, and that's sort of where my careful or benign neglect comes from, is like I just know that there's a seasonality in my life where there are times where I'm just so freaking busy that that thing has to be as autopilot as possible at times. But I'll have these crazy ideas, but my impulsive side wants to go do it right away. And a lot of times, like I have a little on my phone, I use the Apple iPhone Notes, and I just start to write down my ideas of things that I want to change. And then I just let them sit there for a while. I kind of proverbially sleep on it more than one night, though. I just let them kind of sit there. And what ends up happening is that some of the things that I wanted to change, I changed my mind on, right?
Absolutely.
Other things, something that I thought was a problem doesn't need to be solved anymore. Kind of goes away on its own.
Totally.
And yeah, it sort of helps bake those ideas and solidifies those ideas in. And then, I could be blaming X for Y, but then 2 weeks later, I'm like, the more I think about it and the more I observe, it's not X causing Y, it's, R causing Y.
Yeah.
And so I've liked, I stumbled into this by accident where I'm like, I'm just too busy to do these 5 things, so I'm just going to write them down so I don't forget. And then a month goes by and I revisit that list and I'm like, the hell are you talking about? You're not going to do that. That's sort of where, deconstructing the NSA came from. That's where I started to think about my light intensity a bit. I just really been pondering something silly, but it's what keeps me enthusiastic of like, how could I supercharge my tank for corals that, people kind of, I don't know, they think of them as weeds and, they don't care. Like, I mean, ironically, some of the more challenging corals are doing great, right? But I'm curious about, and this all is circular, right? Where you started to not accept certain corals in your studio from, you were not cool with them just dwindling or not doing well anymore. You're like, I need to understand the why. And that really sparks some questions in me about certain corals in my tank. So But I just think let those ideas bake a bit. Don't always impulsively tinker.
Dude, you are preaching my freaking religion right now. I feel like anytime I'm giving it look, anytime I'm looking at a tank, I can't just look at the tank. I'm always thinking about what should I do? Do I need to clip that coral now, or do I need to wait a month? Do I want to change up the flow this way, or do I want to bring the lights down, or do I want to turn the spectrum a little wider? I like to say that I ruminate on stuff. Ruminate is the process of ruminants, such as cows, fermenting the food that they eat over a long period of time to extract the most nutrients possible. So I like to ruminate on it. I like to pray on it and just really consider, all the options. And, sometimes I'll take a long time to come around to doing whatever I was planning. And, when I do it, I'm just like, man, I'm really glad I considered what it is I wanted to do for so long. Absolutely. But then once I start working on the tank, I'm like, all right, now let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the list. But, I do have a small list of things that I think you can learn from observing your tank. I just want to bust through these. But, what is the usual water level height of your aquarium? Like, for example, I'll know that if the water gets a little too high, my overflow teeth need to be clean, because there's stuff growing in it. And I can just see the water level. Like, I know where that water line is supposed to be from daily observation. So if it's too high, I must have some clogged filter teeth. That's on our, monthly maintenance schedule. If it's running a little too low, guess what? My return pump probably needs cleaning, right? I don't need to sit there and measure the flow of the tank of the pump coming out. If I know if it's running low, then clearly the return pump needs to be cleaned. Simple observations that will clue you into things about your tank. What is your usual skimmate production? Is it really wet? Is it really dry? How much is it going to put out about a week? If you're cleaning out every few days, you're not really going to be intimately familiar with how much it should produce, right? So if it's running a little too wet, maybe your air intake, where anywhere along the assembly from the hose to the venturi, maybe that's clogged and it's allowing the pump to push more water. Or if it's running a little bit more dry and you constantly have to raise the water level inside the body, maybe you need to clean the needle wheel. The needle wheel impeller, as it gets clogged up, is going to pull in a higher percentage of air to water. And, reasonably, both of those things need to be clean. What are the typical noises of your aquarium, man? And the thing is, people have an innate sense to hear a sound and touch a device and know whether it's coming. The vibration is the same that you're hearing, and I feel like that's really, really informative. What does your pH usually run at? I feel a little bit guilty for putting it out there that people should aim for a higher pH because it's got people fixated on this higher pH issue. I'm like, I'm pretty sure your corals, if your tank is averaging 8.1 on a long enough timeline, all things being equal, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. These ideas about pushing envelope, that might be more suitable for commercial purpose. Here's another really good one. How much and where does the detritus accumulate in your aquarium?
That's a good one.
I have a lot of my flow in the back bottom of my aquariums, so all that stuff kind of ends up at the front. So that's a kind of unconventional system, but it makes it really easy to suck out and to know when it is. But more specifically, if you have nuisance algae, hair algae, Valonia, Bryopsis, Enteromorpha, those are going to usually end up in specific places. They're going to concentrate there. Oftentimes it's a place that your tank can't reach or your other herbivores can't really get to, or a combination with the detritus accumulation. So sometimes you might not even have a real algae problem. You just might have one little trouble spot. An extreme example is the top of your return pump outlet. Right, it's too high and surrounded by flow for your herbivores to get to. That's an extreme example. But if you have more naturalistic live rock, with a little pocket that builds up nutrients, man, you can bet those spores is where they're building up. And similarly with cyano and aptasia and vermitid snails, man, I'm not really battling them. I've been really diligent. They're so easy to remove. But I swear, man, I had this one tank where they were kind of endemic to the aquarium, and they would always show up first on this one particular ridge of rock. There'd be like no vermitids in the entire tank, and then that ridge would get 3. So I didn't have to focus my snail assassination efforts all over the tank. I just had to look at this one spot, and if I got those 3, then they wouldn't really be able to propagate. So little things like that you won't even discover unless you just put some effort into the observation of your tank while you're not messing with it. Those two things might not be exactly the same. But yeah.
Sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say your nano video was a good example of something that I think about a lot, and that's you're talking about observing your tank. Those areas where your herbivores can't reach the output of your return pump, or even
Inside your Vortec or propeller pump.
on the old tank, I used to have gyres sitting up pretty high, so similar, like they'd grow little turfs at the top, and usually, so I always took that as the 2 indicators. One, I'm growing the good kind of algae, the algae that things like to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I had issues with some of the more primordial soup, as I call it, the dinos, the diatoms, the cyano, there's already a lot of talk about your nutrients bottoming out. But when my refugium, Caulerpa, Chaeto scrubber is not growing well, when I don't see turf algae in those hard to reach areas, that always coincides with me having that primordial soup issue, right? Stuff that nobody wants to eat. And when I am able to shift the balance back to turf algae, and I hate to say it, even Valonia, then I know that I'm not really having much battles with cyano, dino, diatoms anymore. And the problem with Valonia is, there's stuff that eats it, right? Certain cell types, self-intangs, Mithrax, I've had some mixed results with. You and I have experimented with Brightwell Razor. There's ways to tackle it, but in a nano reef, where you're going to have, so my thing about algae is you can't eliminate algae from a reef tank, right? You can only shift the balance of, not balance, the competitive advantage towards the kind of algae that you can manage. So turf algae, your tangs are going to graze that down. Your turbo snails are going to love that crap. Urchins eat it. That's a lot easier to manage with herbivory, right? And we've talked about if you remove herbivores from a reef, everything goes crazy. All those turf algae grow. So when I saw your nano and you were talking about a little bit of a Valonia problem, like I don't see that as a problem because you can manage that. But that's just kind of a fact of life, right? Like I think if you try to...
anyone listening right now who has a newer tank
yeah,
and you're seeing Valonia, it explodes before it goes down.
it does. It can.
Yeah.
I've had a tank that exploded with it, and it was brutal. And I took every rock out and I scrubbed
It's
them.
shocking. It's disturbing to see. And this is one of those things without doing anything else, you might walk away and come back and be like, how was there less Valonia than 2 weeks ago?
I personally, humbly think if you try to beat those green algae with nutrient removal, or you're scrubbing your phosphates out, you're carbon dosing. I've been down that road, and it always ends up in Cyanoville. So, to me, from an observation, going back to the coasting, I always kind of feel like if I've got some turfs growing in some hard to reach areas, that just means that my tank is where I want it to be, and it's jiving, and it's a little ecosystem, and things are going to happen, right? And sure,
if I count yourself blessed if these nuisance algae, aptasia, vermitids are concentrated in one place. It makes them really easy to target.
Yeah, and if I removed all my herbivores, I'm sure that stuff would spread, right? But that's when I know I'm kind of in a happy place. Like if all that crap is clean of algae, then honestly, there's something else going on that's wrong,
Mm-hmm. But a
Um,
really cool observation about cyano was, for the last 6 months, I've been pretty diligent about nitrate dosing, and I know roughly what my nitrates are in 20 aquariums. And I have this one aquarium that I've just don't have enough fish in. And I haven't mixed, I have plenty of potassium nitrate. I haven't mixed any in a while, so I haven't been dosing it. And this one tank, what do you think is happening with this tank that has 0 nitrates?
cyano.
Yep. I have weird patches of cyano. Like a little bit is expected in every reef tank. But this one reef tank, I'm like looking around, like there's cyano over here, there's cyano over there, there's cyano around this coral. I'm like, what the heck? What is going on in this tank? And I'm like, oh, the nitrates are 0. I'm not saying you raise your nitrates to get rid of cyano, but they have nitrogen fixing bacteria, so they're able to use the other nutrients. And so there's a really good explanation to be made for having this. It's not a problem. It's just I don't have it. There's so much water flow in all my tanks, but this one system that has been just nitrate challenged, if you can say, it's got just uncharacteristic spots of cyano. And the only reason I was able to notice that is because I pretty much just coasted that tank for about a month. I'm like, nothing else has changed other than the nitrates have really kind of been 0.00 for about 30 days.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, somebody who studies this stuff is going to totally scream at me in the comments, but my takeaway was always, people talk about Redfield ratio, but the explain it like I'm 5 way to talk about it is, they need these building blocks, right? They need carbon,
Mm-hmm.
nitrogen, phosphorus. And if your nitrogen is 0, then an organism that can fix nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, has a competitive advantage. Like, hey, I got this. I can get it from somewhere where you guys can't get it. Whereas
Can
if
you imagine
Yeah.
talking to your 20-year-old self and telling yourself to treat cyano by raising the nitrates?
Well, all these talks about people saying reef keeping is harder today, and I'm like, is it? And now they're talking about, our old lights had UV in them, which I don't necessarily agree with that idea, but maybe our tanks were just a little dirtier and we were battling more manageable things. Our
Mm-hmm.
tanks also ran hotter. It's all about competitive advantages of different algae, and I know cyano is not an algae, but of these microorganisms, and so.
Mm-hmm.
But that goes back to just knowing your tank, right? And seeing what could be a mild, because a little patch of cyano ain't the end of the world, right?
Nothing. Not even. I don't even. Doesn't even register for me
Yeah.
unless it's encroaching or getting any close to any kind of coral. If it's just in one little area, dude, that thing might just go unnoticed for another 2 months. It's not going to grow out of control. It's just not. But
Yeah.
I think this has been a really informative discussion of letting your reef tank coast. And the thing is, again, if you've been in the hobby for a year or 2 or 5, you might not have left your reef tank alone a single day in your reef keeping career. But letting your tank coast and really paying attention to observing the parameters of your tank, the performance of your equipment, the behaviors of your fish, the reactions of your corals, that's a awesome dry run for leaving your tank alone,
Mm-hmm.
right? We all want
That's
to
a
travel.
good point.
We all want to go somewhere, and if you do these trial runs where you just kind of hands off and just see what happens for a few days or a couple weeks. 2, 1, you're going to be more comfortable leaving your aquarium knowing that it can coast without you looking at it for up to a couple of weeks at a time. I feel like 2 weeks is kind of like the sweet spot. But 2, it's also going to inform you on what you might need to do to kind of fill in those gaps to feel comfortable to leave your tank alone for a couple of weeks. I do not lose sleep. When I'm out of town, I miss my tanks. I don't worry about them. I miss them. I have no concerns that something or other is not getting done. If I leave for a long weekend, there's no one watching them. That's because I have fewer pieces of equipment, more critical pieces of equipment to perform a specific function, and not a lot of little finicky devices that need a lot of looking after.
Yeah, that's a great point. is the whole idea of um, how much intervention do you have to take on a tank in a 2 week period? And what are the pieces of equipment that could require intervention? Not, you may pick a 2 week window and everything goes fine, but when you are busy, what are the things that could break down, and then use that to apply towards, well, what if I want to go on a 2 week cruise, right? And um, in terms of designing a carefully neglected tank, don't overcomplicate it. Don't pick a methodology that requires a lot of intervention. Don't put gadgets on your tank that require a lot of maintenance, right? Um, I've seen some people like put little videos together of, here's what you should do if you go on vacation and for your reef tank, and their level of attention, having a tank sitter and this and that, it's way more complex than anything that I do, right? I just put an
Above and
automated fish
beyond.
feeder and I set the skimmer to skim dry, and obviously I checked out my dosing containers and everything is full, but then I go. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I do like having a controller to intervene remotely,
Mm-hmm.
personally, but it's a very simple tank, right? If you're doing some kind of dosing where you're micro dosing all these little trace elements every day from little dropper bottles, and you go on a 2 week vacation, what happens there? Are you going to hire
Nothing.
somebody or
Nothing
ask somebody?
happens.
Well,
The-
but are you going
When
to
you
ask
dose those
somebody to
things,
do that, right?
when you dose those things, your corals do incrementally better. When you don't dose those things, they're just fine. They're just fine.
And what's the
Acrobat.
maintenance on those auto testers, right? I get mixed stories on those, some good, some not so good.
I don't think anyone's run a single auto tester 2 years and uninterrupted. I'm not even talking about refilling the reagents or whatever, but to me it's just not the solution. There's so many moving parts, but don't want to get into that too much. But yeah, it sounds very interesting to have a session of reef therapy where you talk about not doing anything to your reef tank. Look at how important and how informative it is. Yeah, I hope everybody has gotten something out of it. Even if you're into your reef tank, it could just be a fun exercise, a very informative exercise of your personal reef tank. Like, how does your reef tank behave? Your own. I have, about 20 tanks. One thing about having so many tanks, when I set up a tank for the first time, man, I'm not in love with it. I'm not like, committed a relationship to it in my mind share for about 3 to 6 months, sometimes up to a year, because I don't know how it's going to behave. I don't know how the corals are going to react. Some kind of corals I do, but just let it coast, let it run. There's times to really be involved with your aquascape, your coral placement, your nutrients, and your trace element additives, and all the things. And there's obviously times to just sit back and just let it go. Hopefully you've set everything in motion that you don't have to babysit it 5 times a day or even 5 times a week. Those are the best tanks, man. If you've seen these old school reef tanks or even current awesome displays, I'm telling you, those things are not, they are set a certain way. And I want to give a shout out to the service guys.
I was about to say
Service
maintenance tanks are a great example of this, right?
Maintenance guys and service companies, I think they are some of the best reefers in the hobby today. They had to figure out an overarching recipe to see a reef tank 2 to 4 times a month. Probably once a week is kind of like the usual for tanks that get professionally maintained. But these guys, they have to figure out how to do everything they need to do once a week within 1 to 2 or 3 hours. And they're not going to see that tank for another week. And they do not want to get a phone call. They do not want to get a phone call from the client about how that tank is maintained. But definitely, I really feel there's a lot more to be learned from these aquarium service companies and how they automate the tanks in ways that are going to not cause them to get a phone call. I've talked to a lot of maintenance guys, and most of them are not all about the controllers. There's a lot of controllability built into our aquariums, and if you engineer the system in such a way, you really won't need to have the fallback. Now, to your point about having that remote access to things, I have remote access to just about everything. Everything is cloud, everything is Wi-Fi controlled, so I don't need a controller to perform that function, but that function is really important. It is really nice to be able to fire up the camera and just kind of know what needs to be done, and just from my phone. I do have pages and pages of apps. I do have pages of apps to make changes as needed. But yeah, I hope this has been a really, I think it was kind of serendipitous that we talked about negative space aquascape as a prelude to not doing stuff to your reef tank, because the absence of doing something is also doing something to your tank. I'm not trying to sound philosophical, but there's truth in that. Let the corals be, and they will acclimate and adapt to what you've provided for them.
Yeah, it was kudos to you for bringing this subject up, and yeah, you brought up some really good points. I really dig the analogy to a dry run of you going out of town and stuff like that. I mean, there's so many benefits beyond getting to know your tank better, getting to be more in tune when something's wrong, and also just having a comfort level of knowing that if life gets in the way, it may not even be a vacation. It may be just something bad happened, and you got to take care of your family. You got to reprioritize your time. Somebody's not feeling well, whatever, work, something blew up at work, knowing that, your tank's going to handle it just fine because you've purposely gone through that dry run, and you know what to look for. You know which minor maintenance items you do need to stay on top of, and it may also help you reevaluate, and like I said, write down that list of changes. You might find yourself saying, I don't want this high maintenance gadget on my tank anymore. You may start to make changes to simplify and make your tank
Streamline.
more resilient. Yeah.
So
Good
speaking of
talk,
which,
man.
I did the opposite. I had my first electronic auto top-off device in
What?
7 years. Yes, hell is
Mr.
freezing
Float
right
Valve, what happened?
I'm just reviewing this new product from Auto Aqua. It's a hang-on back, kind of all-in-one, really condensed ATO solution, and I installed it onto the Nano Reef Tank, not because it needed it, but just because I want to keep my finger on the pulse of stuff. And today we were just taking bets of I have a 7 or 8 gallon auto top-off reservoir I've had for years. Fits perfectly in the bottom stand of the Red Sea Reefer Nano, and we're like, yeah, I don't think we're going to be topping off this tank until July, because it has a lid, over the most part of the tank. So very little evaporation. It doesn't use up more than a gallon a month, about a liter a week. But this is actually a small stepping stone into, I can add a little bit of minerals. I can do let's say a triple dose of calcium buffer and alkalinity. So calcium buffer and magnesium to the reservoir, and that's going to be dispensed over the next 4 months.
What was the stuff, not the calcium formate, not the all for reef, but the same company used to have a powder. It was biocalcium or something like that?
Yes, Tropic Marin Biocalcium. That was the first additive I ever used.
You could put some of that in that.
I remember you'd mix it up and just let it bubble off. I don't know what the CO2 was about. That was before, I had any kind of formal chemistry training, but we'd mix it up outside the tank and let it bubble off and then pour it into the aquarium. And that's that and Coral Vital. That was the two things you needed to add to your tank and nothing else.
So I have a question for anybody that has, what is the Fluval Evo tanks? I have a spot where I just want to put a tiny tank, but I hate carrying jugs of water, right? So I've always positioned aquariums in my house in a way that I could run a line for my RO trash can, and just dose it in and not ever have to carry. I had tanks where I'd have to carry a bucket of water up the stairs, and I'm done with those days. But I'm curious if anybody has this tank and is listening, what is the evap? And I know that varies on where you live, but what is the evap with the stock hood, the stock light, everything covered up? Because I remember the old BioCubes. I had like a little 14-gallon BioCube where I just had, I think, a jawfish or something in there and that thing never evaporated. So if anybody can comment on what the evap is on, and if it's good, like if it's once a month, you got to throw some water in the back chamber, maybe I'll put one in a very remote part of my house. If not, if it's something I got to do every few days, like screw that noise, I'm not going to do it.
No,
so that's a question.
That's a fair, but yeah, if you guys have any comments for us, we're always taking a look at the YouTube channel, and we're really, really excited about having a live session of Reef Therapy at the Aquatic Expo, first weekend of April in Atlanta, Mark's hometown. God, I haven't seen you personally, I guess since last summer, but before that, it was a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be really fun to just really talk pure reef ideas and techniques and field your questions and ask you some of our own. So we're really looking forward to interacting with our listeners at that event. So big thanks to Masna for inviting us to perform this special session of Reef Therapy. Mark, I don't know anyone else who could talk about not doing stuff to your reef tank for an hour, but I think we pretty much nailed it. And I really think this one, everything else we've discussed are really subjective, but this one is going to be a little bit more in the philosophical territory of like, hey man, let your tank coast. That's kind of the point.
Yeah, and I think we always try to go into it a bit philosophical, where we're not trying to give do as I say. We think this is the best way to do something. It's more just, you may agree, you may disagree with some of the points, but just hopefully it garners some thought-provoking things. Like it makes people think about things, whether they agree or disagree. Like I'm good with comments that say, hey, I disagree as well, because I just enjoy the discussion and I enjoy the deeper level of thinking about methodologies and everything, just
while you're not messing with your reef tank, make sure to go back and listen to the other 32 sessions of Reef Therapy. That'll give you something to do and have some conversations and do some learning and read a book, a physical, tangible book about reef aquariums. So Mark, thanks so much for joining me on this session of Reef Therapy, and we'll see you guys on another session very soon. Later, guys.